Now, Mr. McKeever, are we ready to begin with? I think it's Dr. Lee, is that right?
Dr. Lee, my lord, yes.
Good afternoon, Dr. Lee. As you understand, you're about to be asked questions by Mr. McKeever, who's sitting opposite you. But before that, I understand you're prepared to take the oath.
I am, Your Lordship, thank you.
Sitting where you are, could I ask you to raise your right hand and repeat these words after me? I swear by Almighty God.
I swear by Almighty God.
That I will tell the truth.
That I will tell the truth.
The whole truth.
The whole truth.
And nothing but the truth. Now, Dr. Lee, I'm hard of hearing. You've got quite a large space to fill, and we're concerned that we hear your evidence. Now, you should have plenty of help with these two microphones, but can I encourage you maybe to speak a little louder than you would in normal conversation? I anticipate your evidence will take us to about 4 o'clock. But if you want to take a break at any stage, just give an indication and we'll take a break.
Thank you.
Right. Now, Ms. McKeever.
Could you tell the inquiry your name, please?
Dr. Susanne Lee for professional purposes.
And your occupation?
I'm a consultant clinical scientist, public health microbiologist, and director of Legionella Limited.
And is Legionella Limited the organisation that you work for?
Yes, we're a very small, independent public health microbiology services.
What is its business?
Preventing, detecting waterborne infections, supporting hospitals to develop water safety plans, supporting water safety groups. So it's public health microbiology, but really focused on water, the prevention of waterborne infections.
Now, you completed a written statement concerning your involvement with the Queen Elizabeth University Hospital in Glasgow, is that correct?
That's right.
And are you content to adopt that statement as your evidence to the inquiry today?
Yeah.
Now, I may have cause to take you to your statement from time to time during your evidence. If I do, or if I need to refer to any other document, it will come up on the screen that's in front of you.
Yes, thank you.
Now, you'll be aware that we're interested in your involvement during a period in 2018 regarding the water system at Queen Elizabeth. Now, in brief terms, what was it you were asked to do?
I was initially contacted to ask if I knew anything about Cupria virus, and I, as a result of my background, being involved in lots of waterborne outbreaks, particularly in healthcare, I contacted Teresa Inkster and we discussed the problem, and she invited me to, well, I suggested I came up because it's very difficult to get your head around what is going on unless you actually can see the premises. So we arranged that I would go up and visit the children's ward.
Okay, and then, as I understand it, you subsequently produced a report following that visit.
I did.
I have two dates which may be relevant to that. I have 16th of March as the date of the initial contact. Would that be about right?
Yes, I think so.
And I have a date of, I think, the 25th of April for your visit.
When I visited, yes.
Okay, I'm interested at the moment in the initial contact. Who was it that contacted you? Can you recall?
It was an email from Phil Ashcroft, from who I'd previously worked with when writing the HTM series with him.
And just in general terms, what did that email tell you?
It was just a request if anybody knew anything about Cupria virus. and that he'd been contacted by Ian Storer, I think.
Could we have up on the screen, please, from bundle 14, volume 2, page 101? We see here, and you should be able to see this clearly, this is the end of an email chain. The title of the email chain is forward block URL, external to GDC, forward Cupravidius palculus urgent. You see that?
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately, the way these things print out is they are reverse chronological order. So if we go to page 103, we should find there the start of the email chain. At the very foot of that page, it starts off with an email from Ian Storer, whom I think you mentioned.
That was forwarded from Phil Ashcroft. Yeah.
So the one above is the email that you would have got from Phil Ashcroft.
Yeah.
And the general content of those two emails is, if you said, does anybody know anything about Cupravidius palculus? And that's the first contact you had, as you say. So at the top of that page, we have something beginning, Dear Phil. If we skip forward one page to page 102, we should see the header to that email. At the foot of that page, we see this email header, and this is your response. If we're looking, you see that if we're looking at the foot of page 102.
I can just see at the bottom, it says, it's only a little bit.
Yeah, there's your name sent 2250 on 16th of March to Phil Ashcroft and others, and it's the same title. So that closes page 2 of the chain, and then if we go forward one page to page, we should see. I've fallen into the trap that I tried to avoid. That would be page 103. So at the top of page 103, Dear Phil, that's your response.
That's
is that
my
right?
response to Phil Ashcroft, yeah.
Okay, so here you're saying, sorry for the delay, I forwarded to Mike Weinbrein. I agree with Jenny, it is an uncommon pathogen, and you're talking there about the Cupravidius palculus. And it would be good to have more information. I haven't had any personal experience dealing with this, but I suspect it might be difficult to remove. If the BBC report is correct that bottled water and mobile sinks are being used, I would be a little concerned about the use of bottled water with highly immunocompromised patients, though it's not the same as sterile water, and as there have been previous P. aeruginosa outbreaks in ICU associated with bottled water, it's important there's been sufficient quality assurance to ensure it's safe for this patient group. I also have concerns with the use of mobile sink units unless they've been thoroughly disinfected first, following the Dutch lead and removing water from the highest risk areas and relying on alcohol gel and sterile water only. So that's what you've written. There's quite a lot in that email. I wonder if you could perhaps explain that to us in your own words.
I could. Well, people tend to assume that if they buy a bottle of water that it's sterile. The general perception is it's sterile, but that's far from the case, particularly if it's in, I notice you've got glass bottles, in plastic bottles, because the plastics in the bottle provide a nutrient source, and the naturally occurring organisms in water will use that as to grow. So from the time it's bottled to the time it's consumed, there's continuous growth. So I was aware of an outbreak in Germany where they had 6 intensive care units where, because they had a problem with distributed water, they used bottled water instead.
When you say outbreak in Germany, that would be an outbreak of what?
Pseudomonas aeruginosa.
Okay.
And they were able to show from an unknown bottle and the patient strains that those strains were the safe. So it was the bottled water that was contaminated.
Okay, and if you recall, the question that was put to you was, does anybody know about Cupravidius palculus? The outbreak you mentioned was Pseudomonas. There are similarities.
They're both gram-negative organisms. They are both associated with biofilms in water, as well as with a whole range of other gram-negative organisms. So the fact that it was a different organism, the likelihood that it would behave in a similar way and would come from a similar source was high.
Right, so just to clarify perhaps one thing at this point, and it may be that this comes from me putting too much emphasis on the name of your company, but your company is Legionella Limited. You are by profession essentially a microbiologist.
It's a pun on Legionella and our name.
That I understand. My question was, should I take from that you have particular specialism in Legionella, or is it microorganisms in general?
It's waterborne microorganisms in general.
And would that include the ones that we've mentioned so far, Cuprividius, Pseudomonas?
Yeah, Cuprividius is quite a rare organism, and it's not one that I was aware there'd been an outbreak of before. It had been called other names in the past, including Ralstomia porcalis. So I knew of its existence, knew it was gram-negative, and knew that it had been associated with water. So in all likelihood, it would behave very similar to Pseudomonas aeruginosa, although there are slightly ecological differences with all of these organisms. They have their own niches and biocide, whether they are sensitive to biocides and antibiotics, etc.
Okay, well, I'll come back to much of that as we go on, but the basis for that view is essentially that you have an across-the-board knowledge of microorganisms in water.
And I've taught. I developed an MSc for the London Medical School and Queen Mary's on waterborne organisms, which covered the whole range of waterborne organisms. So I've got quite a lot of experience, yeah.
Okay, now just to conclude the email chain at page 101. We'll see that just below the top email, we've got an email from Jennifer Armstrong to a number of people. You're not one of those people, is that right?
That's right.
And it seems to be setting up a conference call of some kind, presumably discussing the Cuprividius.
I assume so. I know as much as you do about that particular email.
That's fair, but the point is that it terminates in a meeting that you weren't at.
That's right.
Could you now have up your statement, please? That starts at page 30 of this week's statement bundle. The part I'm interested in at the moment will be on page number 69. And you'll see there's a short section of your statement titled Communication with GGC and Dr. Inkster. Refer to email correspondence of 16 March 2018, and that's the correspondence that we've just looked at.
Yeah.
And you see at question 18, you're asked if this was the first contact that you'd had regarding contamination at the hospital, and you've said yes. 19 asks if you had any knowledge in advance of this. You said no, or no. 20 is noting that it was referring to Cuprividius. And then 21 is asking the question, following this email, did anyone from GGC contact you to follow up on your advice? And then there's some follow-up questions for that. And you've responded in the last two lines, none except you received a nice email from Ian Storer thanking me. Did receive a forwarded email from Director of Facilities Alison Hurst via Dr. Inkster asking for availability for a joint meeting with Tom Makin. However, I was told when I replied to Dr. Inkster this was no longer needed. Dr. Inkster told me later when asked about why that they did not allow her to invite me again as they didn't like what I had said. Now, just to clarify the timeline here, in that last answer, what date are you talking about when you are disinvited from the meeting with Dr. Makin?
Well, I didn't. I think it was a few days later I answered the email. I think I can't remember exactly, but it was after the certainly after the meeting, and I can't remember the exact date I got the email. I can't access my emails because I lost my computer, and so I can't remember the exact date of that.
No, that's fine. The exact date's perhaps less important than you say that the email was the 16th of March and you had a visit on the 25th of April. What I'm interested in is whether the disinvitation happened a few days after the email in March or the visit in April.
It was quite a bit longer than that, because I just thought it was odd that I hadn't had any contact to go back. But they obviously decided they were going to invite Tom Macon instead. So I just took it that Tom was going to provide microbiology services and they didn't need me anymore.
When you say it was odd that you hadn't been invited to go back, does that mean that this disinvitation that you're talking about would have been after your visit in April rather than after the emails in March?
Yes, it was after my visit.
Okay, thank you. Well, you conclude that answer just by saying that there are the words, as they didn't like what I had said. You given that as the reason for not being invited back. What did you understand that to mean?
Well, they weren't too happy with what I said, and I can't remember exactly what I said, but I know we talked about, I was quite amazed that they hadn't put a disinfection system into the hospital. So normally, and particularly when you've got a high-risk population, you would use a belt and braces approach and have both temperature and biocide control.
Okay,
and it's a very large hospital with very sick children in it. I would have expected that. And I'm assuming that's what they didn't like.
I'll come on to those specific matters later, but am I right in saying that those are things that you brought out in your report?
Yes.
When you issued it at the end of April. And so the words, they didn't like what I had said, would refer to things that were in the report and not to things that you'd said in this email about the bottled water. Would that be right?
Oh, I don't think it was anything to do with the bottled water, no.
Okay, thank you. Now, you mentioned Dr. Inkster also in that answer. And I think you also mentioned that you'd had some contact with Dr. Inkster between the initial email and the visit. What was the nature of that contact?
Teresa phoned me up from time to time to ask my opinion or just to get support in her thinking that she was along the right lines, but I haven't got any notes or anything from those. It was just a general conversation about, what was happening, I think, and whether she was on the right lines. It was really just to give her a bit of support in her thinking, I think.
That would be her would that be her thinking about the cupravidis issue that you were initially contacted about?
And what was going on with the water. And I know we had conversations about the drains at some time. So it was just ongoing, as things were developing. And I can't tell you exactly how many telephone conversations or emails we had. But
okay, so it would be occasional contact.
Occasional contact, yes.
And it might be about a number of things to do with the water system. Yeah. Thank you. Now, over what sort of period might you have been contacting her?
I really can't tell you, because I've had regular contact with Teresa ever since I met her. I respect her. I actually invited her to be part of committees that I chair, writing guidance and standards, and so I couldn't pinpoint exactly.
That's fine. It goes way beyond, though, this particular email
absolutely.
chain in March and the meeting in April.
Yeah.
Well, if we move back to that visit on the 25th of April, you describe, if we move right to the beginning of the statement at page 31, at question 2, you've given some description of the visit. And then on the next page at question 3, you were asked about limitations on the visit. And you say there at the start of your answer that the intention of the meeting was what you understood to be a preliminary visit, to visit Ward 2A of the hospital. Why did you have the impression that this was a preliminary visit that you were being invited on?
Because I'd had a phone call, an email, sorry, from Teresa to say that she'd had discussions with her colleagues and they would like me to be involved and to put it on a proper footing. I can't remember the exact words, but something along those lines.
And you may have answered this already, but when you say that you'd had an indication that colleagues wanted you to be involved, that would mean involved in what?
In supporting them in regular visits to help them manage the situation with regards to the water and the drainage systems.
Would that be cupravidis specific, or was that more general?
No, I think we'd realised by that stage that it was not just a single organism. If you've got something like that, it's almost certainly to be biofilms with lots of different organisms in it, which could pose a threat, particularly for that group of patients. They are so immunocompromised that any potential opportunistic pathogen poses a risk to them, and it was likely if cupravidis was there, then others were likely to be there as well.
Okay, but in the event that general involvement didn't come to pass, did it?
No.
And you did say later on that you never received an official remit or instruction. So if we restrict ourselves for the moment just to the period March and April of 2018, what did you understand was being asked of you around that time?
Well, I think with discussions with Teresa, it was that I would go up and visit the ward so I could see where the water systems are, what they had, what the problems were, and it was specifically for that ward initially because we knew it was only going to be a short visit because of my time limitations, really. And I guess I expected that there would be a meeting with others from the team, the estates team, and infection control while I was there, and yes, that's how it usually works, and it did on this occasion.
Okay, I'll come on to those meetings in a moment. But you mentioned that ward is visiting. Which ward was that?
2A.
And 2A would have been within the Children's Hospital, is that correct? I'll come on to the visit in just a moment, but before I do that, you may have answered some of this already, but we discussed Legionella, cupravidis, Pseudomonas. Are these specifically waterborne organisms?
Pseudomonas can be spread by lots of different ways from water, but also splashes from water. But people are also colonised on their skin and in their gut, so there is the potential for person-to-person transmission and staff to patients and the other way around, and then from patients to outlets, handles, surfaces. So there's many different ways of transmission of Pseudomonas in particular.
One other that comes up in your report is Stenotrophomonas.
It's another gram-negative and again associated with waterborne infections and growth within biofilms. And there's a whole list of others that would fall into that same category.
Okay, the four I've mentioned, do they have similarities with Legionella?
Well, only in that they are gram-negative. Legionella is slightly different in that it tends to grow systematically within the system, so it tends to be throughout the system, whereas Pseudomonas and some of these other gram-negatives, particularly Pseudomonas, requires oxygen for growth, so it tends to be in the more aerated parts closest to the outlet, where it will grow in sometimes in quite dense biofilms if the outlets have not been flushed.
But all of those would be matters of concern to you, would that be right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Right, I mentioned that come on to your visit. Could we have bundle 8, page 134, please? Now, after your visit, you prepared a report, was that right?
Yes.
And would this be the front page of the report?
Yes.
I mentioned 25th of April for the visit. The report's also dated to you, see right in the centre of the page, 25th of April. Did you finish the visit and then type this up straight away?
No, it was. I should have actually put from the meeting on that, but yes.
How long after the meeting can you recall? Did you?
I can't remember, probably because I had a hospital. I was going into hospital for a treatment, so it was probably 2 or 3 weeks. I can't remember exactly.
I'll take you to parts of the report as necessary when we go along, but just to summarise, it's primarily in the nature of being a series of recommendations. Would that be correct? And if we look at page 1, so that'll be page 135 of the print here, we see your introductory paragraph 1, limitations. You've said this report's an overview of the meetings which took place on 25th of April 18, and then you give some details. In the morning was with some names, Dr. Inkster, Annette Rankin, some other names, and in the afternoon, Theresa Inkster, Annette Rankin again, some other individuals present at that one. Then, and the last 2 lines, because of the limited time, the discussions focused on the Children's Hospital only and included a visit to Ward 2A. So at that point, can I take it from that you were still expecting that there might be other matters that you would have to address?
Yes.
Now, I wonder if you could describe those 2 meetings that you mention in this paragraph.
Not really. It's a long time ago, and I've had lots of similar meetings since.
Insofar as you can, then, I wonder if you give me details. We know who was there because we've got the names in front of us.
Yes, well, I think I had to ask Teresa who was there after the meeting. We sat down and we discussed the issues. I remember we talked about biocide treatment, and I was given an overview of the situation to date with the accrued providers, but other concerns. I think we mainly talked about the lack of biocide treatment, but I really can't remember the detail. I'm sorry.
That's fine. It is more than 6 years ago at this point.
Absolutely, and I visit lots of hospitals.
Yes,
so.
and sitting in plenty of meetings, no doubt.
Yes.
Perhaps visits might, or walking around might be the sort of thing that sticks in your mind a little bit more.
A bit more, yes.
And you did, in fact, undertake a site visit, as you say there. Can you recall who accompanied you on the site visit?
Teresa and I think Dr. Gibson, but I can't be 100% sure of that.
How much of the site did you see?
Just the ward, just the children's ward, really. The walk from where we were sitting and to the children's ward, because I'd flown in the morning and I was flying back the same day, so there was not much time.
So the layout of the hospital is, you may recall, there's a very large building, which is Queen Elizabeth Hospital, and there's a smaller but still large building, which is the hospital for children. The children's ward is in the latter. How much of that latter building did you see? Was it simply one ward, or was it a tour of the building?
No, I think we only looked at the one ward as far as I can remember. Time was an issue.
You think that was Ward 2A?
Yes.
In fact, it says here Ward 2A, thank you. What were your reactions upon seeing the site?
How big it was, which is always a concern from a water perspective, because it means that there's a very large system, and the larger the systems, the more difficult they are to control. But apart from that, not a lot. I mean, it was, obviously a new hospital, but I see lots of new hospitals.
Okay, well, it might help you if we look at your statement then, page 35 this time of the statement bundle. The question here, question 7, is about the water supply and what you might have expected to see. Your answer, you start off, I was surprised that such a large hospital, particularly one intended for use by high-risk patients with compromised immune systems, was not designed to protect patients at high risk of waterborne infections with good design and engineering and a multiple barrier approach to prevent waterborne infections. Now, I wonder if you can explain what you mean in that short passage. You're referring to good design and engineering. What do you have in mind there?
So I've just been involved, my answer might be a bit tempered because I've just been involved with writing some new guidelines to protect high-risk patients from waterborne infections, which followed on from the Papworth outbreak.
When you're talking about guidance, is this the HTMs or is it other guidance?
This is a new technical bulletin to supplement the current HTML.
Right.
It was published on the 27th of August by NHSE.
NHS England.
Yes.
Sorry, Ms. McCann.
I asked you about what you might have expected to see as an example of, quotes, good design and engineering.
Yeah, well, one of the problems, and it's been a problem for decades, is that hospitals are built with a large single water distribution system, so plant room, and then the water is heated and distributed around the wards through various risers and loops which go around the ward and back again, drop back down to the plant room. But we've known for decades that we can't control those because they're just too big. There are so many outlets. We're talking in a big hospital of thousands of outlets, and it's impossible to make sure that they are all used all of the time. And it's really important to make sure that the water flows right up to every outlet, so that if whatever you're using, whether you're using temperature, whether you're using temperature and biocides, there's no point unless you're actually going to get the water containing those right up to the outlet. And with outpatient departments, you've got en-suites with patients who are far too ill to get up and use them. There are all sorts of areas that are never going to be used constantly to achieve that amount of control throughout the hospital. So it's better, particularly for where you've got very high-risk patients, is to have a smaller, unique system for that unit.
What would examples be of the sort of thing you might hope to see as examples of good design and engineering, but didn't see?
Well, mainly that there was no secondary control. WHO have, since 2003, advocated the water safety plan approach to managing water supplies initially, but then it was realised there were far more risks associated with the buildings that the water supplies were going to be in. So we worked for a couple of years and published Water Safety in Buildings. I was part of the WHO group that wrote that guidance, which advocated that this water safety plan approach was then used to manage, particularly in large buildings, how water was managed, sorry for repeating the same word, so that it was safe for the types of users and the types of systems that were in each building. And the amount of care that you put into designing and managing a building would depend on the user group. So if you are designing a hospital, you would expect far more care to be put into how you were going to protect those patients than you would if it was a leisure centre with lots of healthy people using it, for example. And
would the separate systems for high-risk patients be part of that aspect?
Yes, they would, and also having a multiple barrier approach, so that if one failed, you have a backup. So if temperature failed, which it did, there was still biocide in there to protect the patients.
Okay, so can I take it then from that that's two specific examples of good design and engineering that you'd have hoped to see but did not?
Yes.
Right. The second of those was secondary control. Is that what you mean when you refer to multi-barrier?
Yes, and
Multi-barrier
that's the
approach.
biocide would have been. So if they're relying on temperature as their primary control, then having a biocide dosing system would have been their secondary backup control in effect.
Okay, I follow that. So in your view, biocide control, secondary control, would have been appropriate for the hospital that you inspected?
Absolutely.
Would that be so for all hospitals, or is it specific to a hospital of the type that you were looking at in April 2018?
If it was a small community hospital that didn't have large reticulated multiple loops, so multi-storey building in effect, then it may be possible to manage without a biocide. But in such a large building, I don't believe that you can possibly make sure that every single outlet is going to be protected with just temperature control.
Okay, thank you. Moving over the page onto page 36. There's reference there at the foot of the page, question 8 is about an interim measure that was in place, point of use filters.
Yes.
Did you see those when you were in the hospital?
I think so, but I'm not 100% sure.
So you're asked a series of linked questions here at question 8. An interim measure, point of use filters have been put in place in the Children's Hospital whilst a longer term measure was sought. What was your view on the use of point of use filters? Was this an appropriate solution? What, if any, was the risk in using them? In your experience, how can any such risk be mitigated? Were any such mitigation measures in place in the Children's Hospital? Now, you start out by giving your view in your answer that point of use filters are sensible precautionary measures.
Yes.
You would agree with that?
Absolutely.
And then if we go over the page to 37, you set out a list of some relevant factors to consider when deciding whether or not to install these. Now, I will summarise, but I shan't perhaps ask you questions about all of those. But number 1 here on the list is about when filters are fitted, it reduces the activity space. Can you explain that to me, please?
Yes, so that is the space between the tap and the basin floor, if you like, where you got room to wash your hands effectively without touching the tap or the basin. So you need to have a decent amount of space so that you're not actively contaminating the outlet as you're washing your hands.
When you say contaminate the outlets, how does that happen?
If you touch them. So particularly if you've got a point of use filter, you don't want to touch the outlet because if you get soap onto the outlet, and it applies to taps as well, that acts as a nutrient source for Pseudomonas to grow and other organisms as well.
So the problem you're hypothesising here is that it's as simple as the filters might be large, reducing the space.
And they reduce the space from the outlet, the end of the outlet, to the floor of the basin. So it's, instead of having your outlet end up there, it's actually down here and the basin is here. So you've got very little, it's very difficult to wash your hands without touching the outlet.
Item 2 in your list here, you're referring to an air gap. Is that linked to that particular problem?
It is. An air gap is required under regulations so that you don't get backflow from the water in the basin up through the outlet and contaminating the water supply that's coming in through that tap. So that air gap is required to prevent backflow up through the tap or up through the filter when you've got one in place.
So in its simplest terms, the air gap means that the tap should be higher than the theoretical highest that the water can reach.
Absolutely.
Did you see any indications that that was an issue when you looked around the hospital?
I think so, but I think there was a small, these silly cloakroom wash hand basins that if you fit a filter to, then there isn't room to, they're bad enough anyway because you get splashes from them as soon as you turn a tap on in a hospital environment. But with a filter on, then that's even worse.
Okay. Number 3, we don't perhaps need to look at that, relates to the potential for the filter becoming blocked.
Yes.
Number 4 is you're considering the risk of splashback from the configuration.
And again, that's because the filter is much closer to the drain than an tap end would be.
And in its simplest terms, would that be that the water comes out directly into somewhere where it might cause splashing?
Creates splashback with drain water in effect onto the surface of the filter. Yeah.
Why is that a particular problem if it's drain water?
Because drain water is an ideal nutrient-rich environment which lots of bugs will grow in, including Pseudomonas, lots of other gram-negatives, all sorts of organisms. And if the sink has been used for disposal of wastewater from patient hygiene, from bowls of water used to wash them, for example, or sometimes antibiotic giving sets are put into the basin because there's nowhere else to put them and they're wet, then there's a possibility for bugs to acquire antimicrobial resistance and they will swap those within the drains. So the drain is a nutrient-rich growth medium for bacteria in effect.
Okay, now that's very clear on how that might create a problem. Again, was this something you saw in the hospital?
I didn't look down the drain, but it's something you see in every hospital has a problem with growth within the drains.
Okay, thank you. 5, 6 and 7 on the page are dealing with potential for other sources, potential for contamination, poor fitting, cleaning or improper sampling techniques. Would those be things that you saw during your visit?
No, I didn't. But again, there are common things to watch out for when there are filters in place or you're considering putting filters in place. So that would be on my checklist, for instance, of things that we should consider if point of use filters are going to be used.
And if you'd come back for more visits, then you might have been looking specifically for that. And number 8, just for completeness, is relating to what might be potential defects in the filters themselves if they're fragile.
And again, it's doing due diligence to look at the validation of the filters. So different manufacturers have different types of filter and different types of casing. So I would look to see their data to see what validation they carried out for any particular filter.
And again, would that have been something that wasn't for this visit?
It would be something I would have advised the water safety group to do before they decided on which filter they were going to fit.
Okay. Over the page, on page 38, there's another list where you've given examples of how those risks can be mitigated. And indeed, the first one is the due diligence approach you've mentioned. Other matters you're referring to are proper fitting, awareness training and sampling and fitting and reporting processes. Again, did you see any indications during your visit of those mitigation measures having been taken?
No, again, that would be things to consider when you were deciding what filters you were going to use.
Thank you. I'm going to ask you now about, once the visit's complete, your general assessment of the system. Now, again, can you summarise for me the question at the time of the visit that you understood you were being asked to address?
Really, it was to look at the ward to see if I could identify any particular issues that might lead to contamination of the water system and drainage system.
And did you come to a conclusion?
Well, the design of the ward wasn't ideal because the way that the sluice rooms were at either end meant that if you had been bathing a baby or using water for any use in the patient area, it was a long way to walk to actually dispose of that water down the sinks. And there are risks physical risks with that, such as slips and trips, but it increases the likelihood that nurses are not going to want to leave their patients and spend a long time walking to either end of the ward to dispose of water. So that it increases the risk that they'll actually put them down the wash-hand basins in the patient area.
In general terms there, are you describing a design issue?
A design issue.
Certain features have been put in the wrong place. And those features are sluice rooms.
Yes.
I'll perhaps come on to those in due course. Since we've got page 38 up on the system, at this point, you're being asked for your views on a number of discussion points. Now, am I right in thinking these discussion points are the same points that arose when you were compiling your report?
Yes.
And in the questions that follow, which we'll come to some of them, but you're discussing things like water temperature, pipes, fungal contamination, training, a myriad of things to do with the water system.
Yes.
As I said, these things are addressed both in your questionnaire and in the report. The questionnaire is considerably longer, more detailed than the report, so I'm going to stick for the most part to the questionnaire, if that's fine. Now you start off, the first question, question A, there is asking about the importance of maintaining temperature control. And you go on to speak about poor temperature management and the scope that allows for the proliferation of organic material. Now, just in general terms, and you describe this later, but I'll summarise it for now. There are issues that arise from temperature moving outside certain parameters, and those parameters are broadly that the range, if the range is kept for cold water below 20 degrees and for hot water above 55 degrees, would that be right? That's where microbial proliferation is generally under control.
Yes.
And one of the things you note later on in your statement is that the aim should be to keep water in the cold water tanks 2 degrees less than 20 degrees to allow for heat gain between the tank and the outlet.
Yes.
The reference there is the foot of page 84 of the bundle. I don't need to take you there, but I wonder, can you explain what you have in mind there for allowing for heat gain between tank and outlet?
Well, what you want is to achieve ideally less than 20 at the outlet, but particularly in a large building, there is going to be quite a distance between the water storage tanks and the outlet. So it allows for you having a maximum of 18 degrees in effect coming into the tank and still being able to achieve, if the design is right, less than 20 at the outlet. So it allows for that, what we know is going to be heat gain during its distribution during the system, that a well-designed system should be able to achieve that 2 degree tolerance.
As I understand it, when it came to write your reports, am I correct that you didn't in fact have data relating to the temperatures?
No, I think there was a problem with the database. I think it had been lost at that time or just around that time, so it wasn't possible to look at any data.
But I understand also that you had, in fact, at the foot of this page, the last 4 lines here, you indicate there was evidence of ongoing issues with poor temperature management in the draft review of issues relating to hospital water systems risk assessment. And you say that was sent to you prior to the visit?
Yes.
Just give me a moment, please. Bundle number 8 at page 150. If you could bring that up, please. Is that the document that you're referring to?
It's got a slightly different front page from the version I saw, but I think it had a draft on it when I saw it.
Okay, well, perhaps I'll come back to that, maybe in a slightly different context in a moment. The specific point that I would like you to explain to me is you've been mentioning that a well-designed system should be able to cope with movement from tank to outlet with no more than a 2-degree heat gain. Did I pick that up correctly?
Yes, in a well-designed system, yes.
And the indication that you'd seen was that that was not happening, and in fact temperatures were going outside the parameters.
The information I was given, if I recall correctly, was that they were seeing some warmer cold water temperatures and cooler hot water temperatures.
Okay, well, in the context of what you've said about good design being the method for managing that, what is it in the design that would either be good, meaning that temperature was maintained within the parameters, or was bad, meaning that temperatures varied outside them?
It's avoiding long legs from the water. So you have a loop of water from hot water source. So it goes up a riser, and then on each floor you will have a loop that goes backwards and forwards. And from that loop, you will then have a spur to each outlet.
Did you say hot water system you're describing here?
About hot, yeah, sorry, yes, you asked me about the cold,
Yes.
didn't you? But similarly from the cold. So from the cold water distribution system, it will go to various risers around the hospital. So that's the pipe that takes it up. Sometimes it'll take it down if the tanks are on the roof. And then that will be fed through to each ward, and there'll be severs coming off it that will feed each outlet or equipment or whatever is on the end of it.
And did I pick you up right where you said specifically it was the length of the legs that was determining?
Yes, so
temperature?
the longer the leg, the more likely it is that if somebody only turns the tap on for a short period of time, then they might not empty that little draw water through that is at the same temperature as the supply. So ideally, if you're flushing, you want to make sure that the water that you're getting out of the end of the tap is at the same temperature as the water that's coming in from the supply. But that doesn't happen because the taps aren't used often enough generally in hospital.
Ms. McKeever, your question was, what are the, at least if I was following it, what are the features of a water system which will mitigate or prevent temperature gain in a cold water system? Now, I'm not quite sure that, I'm sure the folks mind that I've got an answer to that.
Well, yes, I
I
need
understand what you say about risk, but I think you were being asked about what are the features of a system which would prevent or reduce that risk. I mean, if I'm following where
Yes.
we are.
Well, okay, to be clearer, sorry if I wasn't quite as clear. So to prevent that happening, you keep your legs as short as possible, you keep your water flowing, you have sufficient insulation to make sure that there was no heat gain from the hot water. Ideally, you want to separate your hot water pipes from your cold water pipes so that there's no transfer of temperature from hot to cold, and the other way around from cold to hot as well, so that you're maintaining those temperatures. So the design should be to achieve the target temperatures at each outlet within 30 seconds for the hot water and 2 minutes for the cold, which is within the Legionella guidance, the HSC approved code of practice.
Okay, so those are 4 specific design features that you're describing. Short legs, more flow, isolation of hot from cold,
and good insulation.
Now, my question was, did you see examples of or lack of those
I didn't
on your
look
visit?
at the distribution system, so I didn't go and look at the risers, for example, on this occasion. I would have done. It was really to get my head around the ward and to see what was on the ward rather than looking in detail. And normally I would have looked at the risk assessment for the building at some point, but it was just so I could see for myself how the how the ward was laid out and if there were any risks that I could easily identify as being a problem.
Okay, so your observations on the specific system at the hospital, would those have been based upon the information? Should we understand those to be based upon the information that you had about temperatures drifting outside parameters?
Yeah, absolutely.
They're not based upon having seen
No, I
pipes
didn't
that
go
were
around
full.
taking temperatures or looking in risers, etc. on that occasion.
Thank you. Now, you've already mentioned that there are other measures beyond temperature and movement that can be used to control a water system, specifically dosing,
Yes.
biocide dosing. You may have already, in fact, I think you've probably already answered my next question. So can I direct you to the minutes of a meeting of the Water Technical Group, which will be at bundle 10, page 18, please? Now, we recall that your visit was the 25th of April 2018, that's right.
Yes.
And this bears to be the minutes of a water review meeting on Friday the 27th of April, 2 days later. Now, again, you're not recorded as having been in attendance here.
No, I wasn't.
But if you look at the names, some of the names will be the same names that you met. I'm interested in the section 2 pages further on. Page 20, there is a section, second block on the page, chemical cleaning is the heading. Do you see that?
Yes.
Now, you're mentioned in there, I think perhaps I should read the whole block to you. It was noted that Raymore and Tayside have silver copper ionisation plants. It was agreed to speak to these boards to ascertain their experience of using these for decontamination. Sanicil concentration used to clear biofilm. We've used 1,000 parts per million, 3,000 parts per million, but there is thoughts that higher than 3,000 would be sufficient to remove biofilm. Susanne Lee's reported, which I take to be you, reported that higher dosage of this product is more effective and would bring us in the short term, but the impact on the pipes and taps from the higher concentration would need to be known. High dosage of hydrogen peroxide can damage the water systems, and IS will forward this information, but noted it causes less damage to the brass within the system. MEK asked what can be done in the meantime to aid with patient safety. Now, first, there's quite a lot in there. First question I have, it's you're recorded, or first observation I have, is that you're recorded as I read it as having discussed the benefits of something called Sanicil over something called hydrogen peroxide. Firstly, is that a fair reading of what's written here?
Sanicil is a silver stabilised hydrogen peroxide, so it is both silver and hydrogen peroxide. It is not something that I would ever advise using in this situation. It is a very strong oxidising agent, and when you know you've got lots of biofilm in a system, it tends to get mopped up and doesn't get as far down the system as you would like it to. And
can you explain that to me? That you're painting a quite vivid picture here of being mopped up and not getting far into the system. How does it actually work?
If you think about silver hydrogen peroxide being quite a voracious animal, and it's very hungry, and you've got lots of food on the surfaces of the pipes.
The food being? Sorry? What would the food be in this?
The biofilm and the bugs and the biofilm. So, but it's only got enough energy to eat so much, so it will eat its way along until it runs out of energy, and then it can't go any further. So some other biocides are not quite as strong an oxidising agent, so their energy lasts a lot longer, so they can get a lot further down the pipe, and therefore they can get nearer to the outlets than hydrogen peroxide. That's maybe a strange way of putting it, but I hope it gets a picture across.
No, I get the picture. The one point I wish to clarify there is when you talk about energy, would I be right in understanding that that's effectively the biocide being used up as it does its job?
Yes, that's its oxidation power in effect. So it uses that. If you think of that as an energy cell, it uses that up.
Okay, but Sanicil would be silver hydrogen peroxide would be a material that got used up quickly.
Yes. More quickly than other biocides because it's such a strong oxidizing agent.
So in fact, your position would be that you wouldn't be recommending Sanasil.
No, my experience, my partners and colleagues as well, is that it is not effective in a highly colonised system. Now, I do know in Scotland there have been some success stories with Sanasil because the water is softer and you don't get the scale developing on the interior of the pipework, which sort of provides a framework for biofilm to attach to. And I haven't previously had any experience in Scotland of using it, but certainly our experience in lots of different buildings has been that it hasn't done the job in the long term.
Okay. You may or may not be aware that, in fact, chlorine dioxide was used to dose the system at the Queen Elizabeth. Are you familiar with chlorine dioxide as a biocide?
Yes.
I wonder, do you have any familiarity with its corrosive properties?
All biocides will have an effect on the materials within the system, so they will all reduce the life cycle. So that's the length of time that's estimated that the system would last. If they hadn't had a biocide in them, then, for example, and this is just out of the top of my head, they may last 25 years, but if you're using a biocide, then plastics will harden and can crack, and you can get corrosion of metals. So they will affect both the plastic components and the metallic components within a water system.
Presumably, the amount by which life cycle is reduced will depend upon strength, on dose, material used, and so forth.
Strength, dose, contact time, yes.
But does it follow from what you're saying that these are all matters that would have to be taken into account at the time when deciding whether or not to use?
It's a balance, and most engineers I've worked with know that there is going to be a reduction in life cycle, but the effect of reducing risk to patients makes that an acceptable risk.
Okay, thank you. Turning back to your statement at page 39 of the statement bundle, please. Now, this is a section dealing with question 10 at the foot of the page I'm interested in. This is a question dealing with pipework, contamination of pipework. And again, the first two lines of your answer are referring to the draft review of issues relating to, that's maybe the document that referred you to earlier.
Yes, it showed me earlier, yeah.
Now, what you're saying about it there was that that document identified that there was documented evidence that there were open-ended pipes on site. I wonder if I just take you to that document. Again, it was bundle 8, page 150 that it started. If we look at page 157, then in the main section of the page, source of contamination, I think 7 lines from the top, there is a statement that there was evidence that pipework was contaminated during construction. You see that?
Yes, I can, yeah.
And 4 pages further on, page 161, there's what would be right in the middle of the page, it's towards the bottom of the screen here. We've got a list 1 to 4. And just below that list, there's a paragraph beginning, it is possible, however, see that?
Yes.
It's possible, however, the original microbiological seeding of the hospital's water system happened when the system was filled with unfiltered water due to the level of breakdown experienced with the filtration unit. There was also some evidence that materials handling and hence cleanliness of the interior of water pipes was not entirely efficient during the construction phase of the hospital, which may also have introduced some contamination into the systems. Now, do you recall having seen that before you did your work in producing the report?
Yes.
And so if we go back to your statement at page 39,
Can you remember who gave you that document?
Dr. Inster.
Dr. Engst. And you must have got that before you prepared your report.
Yes. I think it was still in a draft form.
and if you recall what I took you to at the start of your answer to question 10, there was documented evidence that were open-ended pipes on site. The parts I read out to you, are those in effect what your evidence was?
Yes, I think we also discussed it at the time I was walking around, but I can't be 100% sure what we said, but yes.
Thank you. What conclusions did that lead you to?
It was very frustrating that the water had been put in by the interventory filtration system, because that was designed in to minimise the risk of any contamination from the water supply. When I talk about contamination, it's not really contamination. These are organisms that naturally live in supply water, so they're not contaminants. This is their natural home, their natural environment.
Okay, so you mentioned the bypass there, but you're also talking about presence of nutrients.
Yes.
And also about pipes being left open-ended. Could you describe what your concerns are there?
So if the pipes are open-ended on site, that means they're not actually looking after the components that they're going to be building the system with, and it allows for dust, nutrients, insects, potential rodents to get into the pipework and leave nutrients behind. And those nutrients then will provide a food source for bacteria and other microorganisms to feed on.
So having made those observations or reached those conclusions, I'm interested in how that feeds into your report. So if we could have that up on screen again, it was bundle 8, this time page 136. That take you to. Now, towards the top of the page, there's a bold block, recommendation 1. You see that?
Yes.
And there you're saying water systems should be pressure tested with gas whenever possible, and systems filled with water as late in the build as possible. Once filled, they should be disinfected and flushed to remove nutrients, such as cutting fluids, etc., and kept flowing disinfected as if the building was in full operational use. Records should be kept when the system is filled, commissioned, handed over, and occupied together with all disinfection, monitoring, and flushing, and any remedial works that need to be carried out. There's quite a lot in that paragraph. I wonder if you can explain to me your main concerns.
I was really concerned that they hadn't followed best practice in filling the systems in the first place. So ideally, you want to put water in as late as possible. So until the recent guidance, the water used to be pressure tested initially with water, but then that meant that it was sitting there while all the fitting out, etc., was being done and not managed appropriately. So it's been in guidance for a while. I'm not sure, can't remember off the top of my head whether it was in the 2013 guidance, I think so, in that if you pressure test with air first, then you can sort out most of the problems. If you've got a problem with an unsealed joint, etc., you should be able to see a pressure drop.
So in that scenario, effectively, air or gas is acting as a substitute for water?
Initially, so that's the first stage. But then when you're ready to fill the system, then you will do an additional check to make sure that all the joints, etc., are effectively stopping any leaking.
And that filling, you said, should be as late as possible?
Yes.
So do those two elements, in fact, go hand in hand, and what they are both bearing upon is the idea that the system should not have water in it before it needs to?
Absolutely.
So looking again at your recommendation, you've mentioned those as parts of what you've written here at recommendation 1. But presumably this is too late to be any use to this particular hospital.
It is for the systems, but it's applicable to any equipment that they may subsequently add to or secondary systems to systems. So it's worthwhile putting that in as a reminder.
Okay, thank you. If we move on in your statement, please, to page 43. And here's an entirely different subject matter, something called Aspergillus. Firstly, can you explain what that is?
It's a fungus, so it can cause fungal infections. It has spores which can live for a long time in dry areas. It is a particular problem when buildings are demolished and that the spores are released, and it can then cause infections, particularly in people who are highly susceptible to infections.
Now, fungal contamination was an issue at the hospital. In your report, I'm not going to take you there for simple reasons of time, but in your report you've said it's likely that fungal contamination is a consequence of ongoing demolition work. And if we're going to page 44 of the statement here, you're asked a similar question at C at the top of the page. And your conclusion, dust and debris released during demolition is recognised as a source of fungal spores. Please see answer above for alternative sources. In my opinion, it is possible that the contamination came from demolition works. Now, the word likely, I can take you to your report if you doubt this, but you may take my word for it. In your report, you've used the word likely. In your answer, you've used the word possible for contamination coming from demolition works. Is there any particular reason for the change of word between report and questionnaire?
No, well, except that when there are lots of when demolition work is carrying out, it is considered a high risk. So, but I didn't have the information or any data to say that there was a problem with dust and debris at that time. So I didn't. It was a supposition. It wasn't that I had any data to come to any conclusion.
So in actual fact, again here, should we understand this as being a general observation as to how things such as Aspergillus might arise, rather than something specific?
Yes, and this wasn't something that came out during my visit. This came up afterwards.
Thank you.
Right, and where does this leave us, Mr. McKeever? I think on possible, probable, I'm on possible.
We have possible, as your lordship's seen, page 44. I should have given your lordship the reference for. Likely was the wording in the report. It's the same sentence, but likely rather than possible.
I think Dr. Lee has retreated from likely.
In any event, it's paragraph 3.2 of her report.
The assumption that there is fungal contamination depends on the GGC document that we've been looking at, or does it not?
As I understand it, yes, my lord, but I don't have a reference for that.
I mean, the report talks about Aspergillus and the generality. And a possible source of that is demolition work. It's no doubt my fault for not keeping up, but do we have a source that indicates that prior to the time that Dr. Lee was being asked to advise, there was fungal contamination, including Aspergillus?
I should perhaps ask the question of the witness. What was your basis for understanding that fungal contamination might be an issue at the hospital?
I think this came from a telephone conversation, as far as I can recall.
Telephone conversation with whom?
It would have been Teresa. I really only corresponded with Teresa.
Sorry, I didn't hear that.
With Teresa, Dr. Inster.
Right, okay. Thank you.
And turning back to the report, again, bundle 8, At page 136, at the foot of the screen here, we've got a section beginning training. And it concludes in 2 recommendations over the page. You see recommendation 2 is to summarise essentially that all operational staff and contractors be given wide-ranging training. Recommendation 3 was more specific, that there be a separation of tools used between clean and waste water systems. Did you have any indication that these things were not happening at the hospital?
No, but not at this hospital. But the indications from the lack of care with the pipes that were being installed led me to have some concerns about whether there'd been appropriate training on how to keep systems safe during the construction and installation process.
Right. Can I just take that in steps? Source of information about pipes, I think, comes from the GDC document. Indicates lack of care. From that, you infer other failures.
It infers that there hadn't been appropriate training so that those contractors and installers knew that they should keep the pipework capped and prevent ingress into the pipe during the installation process.
Right. Thank you.
If we look at the statement at page 46, and the answer to question B there, beginning see previous answers. Also due to time limitations, I did not go into training during my visit. Because you were under
that's true, yes.
Because you were under the impression this was a preliminary visit. So again, we should take it that your observations on training, for example, and your recommendations there should be understood in the nature of general observations rather than specific failings that you've observed for yourself.
Yes, but taking account of the fact that there was observations that the pipework hadn't been well looked after, for example.
Going back a page to page 45, you have mentioned in the top paragraph, the page begins with the HSE approved code of practice. And you're explaining there that that's intended to help explain requirements necessary to comply with legislation, explain duties for those with responsibility for health and safety under the law. And you mention associated guidance, HSG 274 Part 2, with examples of good practice and how water systems can be managed safely. You then say, whilst it's not essential that the ACOP approved code to practice and guidance have to be followed, the onus is on those responsible for health and safety, usually in a large organisation, the duty holder supported by the board, to show that if they do deviate from the ACOP and guidance, the outcome should be as good or better than if they had fully followed the ACOP and guidance. A couple of questions coming out from that. Who was the duty holder at the Queen Elizabeth? Are you aware of that?
That's a good question, and it's quite often one that's difficult to answer. It's usually the CEO and or the board. So it may be, it's the person who has ultimate responsible for health and safety on site.
When you're speaking here of deviations from the code of practice, did you have anything specific in mind that you'd seen at the Queen Elizabeth?
The code of practice says if you can't achieve your primary control temperature at all outlets, then you should have an alternative control measure in place. And in such a large hospital, you're never going to be able to achieve control just by temperature alone for all the reasons that we've discussed already.
Okay, so if the requirement in the ACOP is either temperature control or alternative measure...
No, temperature is always, it's seen as the traditional means of controlling, and the ACOP is all about Legionella primarily. So it's all about, that is the traditional way, and I know they were very careful about the wording, of managing Legionella in large buildings, not just hospitals. And if you can't achieve that, then you have to have an alternative means of control.
And the responsibility for having that alternative means in place would fall upon
The duty holder.
And did you see any indication that that had been fulfilled, Queen Elizabeth?
There was no biocide and there were problems with temperatures, so no, it hadn't been fulfilled.
Two pages further on in your statement, at page 47, there is a section dealing with water safety group. Now, I'm not going to ask you about the group, but I do wish to ask you about a couple of references you've got within these answers. Firstly, on page 48, you mention in the last block of text there, and here you're discussing, the question being asked is, in what way was it in what way was it geared towards Legionella? And you've said for high-risk patients in that last block, such as those in children's haematology, oncology, whilst it's important to effectively control the risk from Legionella, this is not the greatest risk to these patients. And you then go on to explain that immunocompromised state means that other pathogens, Pseudomonas is the one you mentioned, might be a greater risk. And then again, over the page at 49, question B there is where you're asked about your recommendation for changing the composition of the water safety group. And again, your answer there starts off, prior to the issues ongoing at the time of my visit, the focus of the scheme of control is focused on the risk from Legionella. Yeah. Now, in summary, is it fair to say that what you're saying here is that there's too much focus on Legionella and that this should be diffused somewhat?
I wouldn't say there was too much focus, but the primary focus was on Legionella. You still have to control Legionella in any hospital system. It affects not only patients, but visitors and staff as well. So there is a requirement to control Legionella, but you have to be aware, particularly where you've got patients at the highest risk of waterborne infections, that you have to manage those as well as Legionella, not instead of, but as well as, in addition to.
So perhaps rather than saying there was too much focus on Legionella, the better way to summarise it would have been there should have been similar focus on other things too.
Yes.
Could we maybe just tease out what you mean by too much focus on Legionella?
I didn't say too much focus on Legionella.
Well, right. Well, correct me on this.
I said it was focused on Legionella, which meant it was...
Mr. McKeever has drawn your attention to an answer which says, prior to the issues ongoing at the time of my visit, the focus of the scheme of control is focused on the risks of Legionella. Is that a good thing or a bad thing or a neutral thing?
No, that's a bad thing because they were only focusing on Legionella and not on the other potential waterborne pathogens as well. So they were ignoring the other risks to patients.
Now, again, just trying to understand that answer. Does that mean that, are you thinking of a situation where water sampling does not indicate the presence of Legionella and the person doing the water sampling is therefore content that there is no infection risk, or are you thinking of something else?
No, I'm thinking that all the risk assessments that they were carrying out were only looking at Legionella and not at the other waterborne pathogens that could have been in the system as well. So the risk assessments were following the British standard for Legionella risk assessments, but not also following the British standard for Pseudomonas and other waterborne pathogens as well. So they were only looking at the risks from Legionella. They weren't looking at the risks from Pseudomonas and other related gram-negatives.
How does that manifest itself in a practical way?
Because Legionella is primarily growth within the whole of the water system, and you can control that by having good hot water temperatures and good cold water temperatures. But Pseudomonas aeruginosa and these others can grow at the outlets by contamination from somebody external to the water system or something external to the water system. That doesn't happen with Legionella. So people can be colonized with Pseudomonas aeruginosa and these other waterborne pathogens and can touch an outlet, contaminate it, and it can then grow backwards up the outlet into the water system. That doesn't occur with Legionella. So there are lots of not just engineering aspects that you need to look at when you want to make sure that your water system is safe. It's also how people are using it, how they're touching it, whether there is any splashing. That isn't a Legionella risk. That's a risk for these other organisms, including Cupria viridis, for example.
So what was it that you either observed or were told that indicated that the potential for organisms other than Legionella to present enhanced infection risk, where, I mean, the measures were not being taken, or?
So the measures that they had in place to manage the water system were only managing the aspects of Legionella. They weren't managing the aspects at the outlet and the drain as well. They were only focusing on systemic growth of Legionella within the system. So whether there was hot temperatures, cold temperatures, whether there was flow, but not whether there was contamination potential from the drains, for example, which would be a way of these other organisms causing infection.
Right. Sorry, Ms. Winky.
No, that's helpful, my lord. Thank you. Perhaps I led that confusion myself with my questions, but to summarise your answer, it's not that focus on Legionella is a bad thing. It's that there has to be focus on Legionella and
the others, yes.
And it's the "and" that was missing, yes, from your perspective. Yeah. Now, at this point, I'm going to take you forward in your statement to page 54, where there's a long section dealing with design issues and various aspects of design, and one of those in particular you alluded to at the very start of your evidence. Now, there are a number of heads to this question. I'm certainly not going to take you to all of them, but I've picked out perhaps 3 or 4 that might be of interest. And I'll just ask for your observations on those, but I'll take you to them first. The first one is the one that you mentioned, page 60, which is, I think, sub-question C in relation to sluice rooms. The question being asked of you there is, can you explain the risks associated with the positioning of sluice rooms? How does the positioning of sluice rooms relate to water contamination, and did anyone else share your concerns in Ward 2A? Firstly, before we do any of that, what are sluice rooms?
So these are there are clean and dirty sluice rooms usually, but the dirty sluice rooms are where, for example, bedpans would be taken to be put into a macerator where they might clean things like drip stands and wheelchairs, and so it's where they carry out the dirty aspects of cleaning on the ward to prevent infection, ideally. So cleaners will use the sluice rooms to empty their buckets and that sort of thing as well.
Okay, did I misunderstand? Was there also such a thing as clean sluice rooms?
Yes, yes. Depends on the hospital. Sometimes they're called clean sluice rooms or clean rooms, but there are areas that are staff-only areas, and in the clean sluice rooms, they carry out things like drug preparation and that sort of thing. not really relevant to what we're talking about.
Okay, so we're primarily interested in the dirty sluice rooms for getting rid of dirty
Water use for personal hygiene as well as water use for cleaning floors and that sort of thing.
Okay, and these are necessary things to have in any hospital.
Absolutely, yeah.
What are important things to take into account from a design perspective?
So ideally, there's very few sluice rooms that are built with enough space to actually carry out their function properly. So that you should be able to have a flow through the sluice room and enough space to set dirty objects down before they're cleaned, and then have a process where they're cleaned and then they're put to another area where the clean items are separated from the dirty end. So ideally you should have a dirty end, space to set things down before they're cleaned or put into a bedpan macerator, for example, and then another area on the other side of that where you don't have the potential for cross-contamination from the dirty objects back to the clean ones.
Okay, so there are rooms with at least two distinct areas, one for dirty objects, one for cleaner objects.
Yes.
What physically is in the room? Are they these drains in the floor? Are they sinks? Are they machines?
There's usually either a bedpan macerator. There is usually a big sink for emptying mop buckets in. There's other sinks for putting water for patient hygiene that's been used for patient hygiene down. Space for cleaning wheelchairs, that sort of thing that have been used by decontaminating between patients.
In short, there are spaces for dirty items to be either
cleaned, or
cleaned
disposed of, yes.
The sluice rooms that you saw at the hospital, what was wrong with those?
The distance from the nurses, where the nurses were actually carrying out their activities. So if they had been washing a patient, then they had a long way. If you imagine a bowl of water and you've got to walk a long way to dispose of that. But time is an issue, being away from a patient who's very ill, but also the risk of dropping water on the floor and slips, trips and falls. But it's really keeping somewhere where you're going to be using water for patient care. There should be somewhere to dispose of that in close vicinity to where their activities are being carried out.
And it's proximity that was the failing that you identified.
Yes.
And to attempt to summarise that, the distance acted as a disincentive to using the rooms. Would that be a fair way to put it?
It was a horseshoe type ward with the sluice rooms at either end. So, it was a long way from the middle where the patients were to get to each end to dispose of the water.
If we go on to page 77, you see at 45 here, you're asked a general question about your concerns regarding the design of the wards, but in actual fact, your answer here is specifically about sluice rooms. And you've told us here pretty much what you've told us a moment ago. The need to walk relatively long distances made it difficult for staff, as well as posing risks of slips and trips. But then in the last sentence, there's a different aspect. There had not been any consideration of the practicalities of using the en-suites for parent-child care, for example. It was very difficult to fill baby baths, and so filters were removed. The sinks had also not been designed to take POUF, point of use filters. And firstly, are these all appear in the one answer that starts off with the bulk of which is about sluice rooms? Are these concerns around baby baths and filters, are these separate issues, or are they part of your concerns about sluice rooms?
The question was the concerns regarding the design, so they're both concerns regarding the design. Was one the sluice rooms, and the other was that the en-suites were not well designed for their intended users.
Okay, well, I'll come back to the en-suites shortly. But just going back to page 62 this time, We have a different section also, confusingly, number C, flow straighteners, aerators. Can you describe these items, please, and the risk that comes from them?
So flow straighteners or aerators are inserts that are put into the inside of the outlet.
By outlet, you mean taps?
The tap,
Yep.
yes, sorry, the tap outlet. So that, and they are like a mesh, can be made of plastic, can be made of metal, and they're there to either make the stream of water less likely to cause splashes, or if they're aerators, they're there to inject air into the water that's coming out, so you actually use less water. But the implications of both of those is they create a huge surface area because of the mesh, and they collect particulates, so bits of scale, corrosion, metal coming from the pipework, which increases the surface area in the end of the outlet as well, where these aerators are, which provide a really good surface for bacteria to attach and biofilms to form. I've been involved several times in my career in problems with Pseudomonas contamination of these outlets, but the one that came to the foremost was the outbreak in Belfast, which resulted in the deaths of some babies. And there was an investigation carried out by a former colleague, Jimmy Waterker at Porton Down, that showed that these aerators were heavily contaminated, over millions of Pseudomonas aeruginosa in one of these aerators at the end of a tap.
So what did you think when you discovered that these items were present at the hospital?
I was horrified. There have been such a lot of press involvement of the Belfast outbreak. There'd been new guidance from the Department of Health that raised this issue and advised about how to reduce the risk, and not having these flow straighteners was in that, aerators was in that guidance.
Okay, thank you. Page 64, please, 2 pages further on. At the bottom of that page, we've got point of use filters. Now, you've discussed those and described those already, so thank you for those. But I'm interested in the, just give me a moment. An issue relating to baby baths. Now, did you see any examples? You mentioned the reduction of space and so on that may be caused by having the filters. And you've also mentioned elsewhere the issue of baby baths being unfillable. Are those two issues linked?
Sorry, can you repeat that?
Are those linked? Was the baby baths being unfillable anything to do with the presence of point of use filters on the taps that might be used for them?
No, that didn't help. That made the situation worse, but the sinks weren't big enough to get a point of use filter. It was difficult to fill them without splashing water onto yourself when you'd filled them anyway. If you can imagine a bathroom basin and trying to fill a baby bath with a bathroom basin, it would be very difficult to do that without getting water all over yourself at the same time.
Right, thank you. So that's a design flaw, but it's not a design flaw around the filters.
It's not taking account of the intended user and uses of the water, yes.
Now, you may recall this without me having to take you to it, but the point of use filters informed 14th out of the 14 recommendations that were in your report. Was that correct? Towards the end of your statement, at page, it's only 3 pages further on, 67. No, it's not, sorry, it's question 67, page 82. The second half of that page relates to an action plan. And you're saying at 66 that you hadn't seen the document previously, but 67 that the action plan, the question is if the action plan was an accurate reflection of your recommendations, and you've said yes. I'll take you to look at bundle 12, page 930, please. We see here a document that's headed Action Plan from Susanne Lee report, attributed to Theresa Inkster and Ian Powrie, May 2018. See that?
Yes.
And if we look here, recommendation 1 is something that corresponds to what we read out earlier.
Yes.
And we won't go through all of them, but if you look at recommendation 2, does that also correspond to one of your recommendations from your report?
Yes.
So in the face of it, that's an action plan dating from May 2018, and in actual fact, if we go one page further on, then we see at the bottom right corner of that page, in relation to recommendation 3, we see a recording that the next meeting that is due on this particular disinfection of tools topic is due on the 4th of May 2018. So on the face of it, this action plan has been drawn up quite soon after your visit.
Yes.
And if it's based upon your recommendations, which are in your report, that rather suggests that your recommendations must have come out within a week or so of your visit, rather than 2 or 3 weeks as you estimated earlier.
Yes. Yes. Okay, I think so.
Could we look now at bundle 27, volume 3, at page 465? And this is headed now Action Plan from Susanne Lee report. You see the recommendations in the first column are the same as we looked at a moment ago. And if we look at the last column, there are 5 columns in this version. The last one is status column, and it's recording in these 2 boxes the status of these particular actions at 17th of August 2018. And if we go on to the next page, we should see something similar in the last column. Do you take it then, on the face of it, that your recommendations were being considered or being put into effect in August?
Yes.
One final specific issue that I'd like to ask you about, which is about water outlets within the hospital, because this was a concern of yours. If we go back to your statement, back to page number 57, the heading of this page is over provision of water outlets. And you'd stated that it was felt there was over provision of water outlets. How was this communicated to you, by whom, etc.? And you've said in your answer there's a common design problem in that the calculation for provision of water outlets guidance is out of date, and nearly all hospitals have too many outlets. Can you comment on your views on the outlets at the Queen Elizabeth Hospital, please?
Yes. This is really based on work that's been done in Holland, but where you've got very high risk patients who are extremely vulnerable to waterborne infections, you should consider removing outlets where the patients might be exposed. It's been shown that splashes from outlets can reach up to 2 meters from that outlet. So if you've got one in a patient bedroom, for example, there is a high risk, unless you have a screen or some other means of preventing splashes from the outlets and the drains from reaching the patient, that it's better to remove those so that you're not putting those patients at risk. And the evidence that removing them from the proximity to the patients has reduced both waterborne infections, the use of antimicrobials, reduced patient stays and overall costs of treatment of those patients, because you're removing that source of infection from their proximity.
Is this something specific to high-risk patients?
Yes. Well, it's more important for high-risk patients, but generally, if you walk around a hospital, you'll find that there are lots of outlets that are never used. In outbreak investigations, I've stood in neonatal units, for example, where there are 2 wash hand basins side by side, and I've watched nurses queuing up to use one and completely ignoring the other because they have to sort of step round other people. So you need to be aware of patients' behaviour, or staff behaviour as well when designing. In other outbreak investigations, I've noticed, well observed, if you have a row of wash hand basins in a toilet, for example, people don't come out and do an acute turn. They tend to come out in a flow, so they won't use the wash hand basin that's closest to the toilet, for example. They will come where it's a nice gentle flow. So the one next to the toilet, the wall, will very rarely get used, whereas the ones where it's a more natural movement will.
So things like that would be things that you say ought to be taken into account when considering how many and presumably where.
And where to put them, yes.
If we go over the page to page 58, at this point there's a list set out in the middle of the page, and here, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you're describing what you consider to be the true costs, as you've put them, or the true factors that should be taken into account when considering whether or not to have a particular number of outlets. Is that correct?
It is.
And you've mentioned things like initial cost of fitting, cost of maintaining, environmental costs, and so on. I mean, just to be clear, is this general observations about water outlets, or is this something specific to the Queen Elizabeth Hospital?
No, it is because there is this policy generally of making the hospital experience more of a hotel type experience. And talking to colleagues, there is a growing body of thought that we should be concentrating on reducing the risks rather than improving patient experience.
You may or may not be aware that the approach throughout the Queen Elizabeth was generally in favour of single occupancy rooms. Can you comment on that from the perspective of outlets that you've just been talking about?
It's a big debate that is ongoing as to which is the greater risk. If you have patients in single rooms, then you reduce the risk of patient-to-patient transmission. But that ignores the fact that if you've got an ensuite in a hospital room, they very rarely get used, particularly where you've got people who are far too ill to get out of bed and use them. And there's some work which I was made aware of recently, which is I can't remember the percentages now, but a very low percentage of outlets in en-suites actually get used on a regular basis.
What's the specific risk that comes about from unused en-suites?
So the risk from that is stagnation, increases the risk of legionellosis, but also other infections from other waterborne pathogens, such as Pseudomonas, for example, and any other gram-negative. So when the patient is able to use the shower, if it's been sitting there for a long period of time, then they're more at risk because of the period of growth when the outlet hasn't been used. It costs a lot more to the estates who have to make sure that their flushing is carried out of those outlets, more disinfection, more hot water, waste of water because you're flushing water that you've treated, you've heated. And the risk from waterborne pathogens is much more increased where you've got water outlets that aren't used.
This inquiry has heard some time ago some evidence about patients' experience of using ensuite bathrooms at the hospital. We've heard accounts of things like blocked drains, water pooling, patients having stand-in pooled water while showering, water failing to flow properly into the drains, water redirecting away from the showers even to the extent of flowing into the bedroom area of the single occupancy rooms, even into the corridor in at least one case. Can you comment upon the risks that are being posed by that sort of scenario?
Well, again, if the patient is in contact with water that has been in contact with the drains, then in effect they're paddling in drain water, and it means that they are then exposed to all the bugs that are in that drain water. So a direct risk of infection if they happen to have any cuts, but also cross-contamination from those areas to others, including the floor in their rooms and in their beds and wherever you walk. If you've been paddling in contaminated water, you're going to transfer that wherever you go. And that is a result of block drains, of drains not being designed within a fall, or people putting things down the drains that they shouldn't, such as paper towels and wipes, which cause blockages, and then the water to back up.
Now, first question I have about that is an obvious one, but drain water is worse than other water. Is that correct?
Yes.
Secondly, I think I picked you up in saying that there were two specific problems that you encounter, blockage in drains and insufficient fall, I think was the way you put it. Drain blockage, I think you've explained a lot about. Can you explain what you meant by insufficient fall, please?
So I don't know whether this was applicable to a hospital or not, but I've been involved in others where what you want is for the drains to fall down into the main drain so that you've got good flow that's going to take any particulates, tissue, etc., feces down into the main drain. If that fall isn't far enough, then you will get blockages because the water isn't able to flow fast enough to take down the particulates, sewage, etc.
So as simple as gravity doing the work?
It's as simple as gravity helping to do the work, yes.
The bigger the slope, the more gravity does the work.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Just a couple more questions for you. They arise out of a BBC documentary that I understand you took part in. It's Disclosure Secrets of Scotland's Super Hospital, it's called, and it came out in the middle of 2020. Does that ring a bell with you?
Just before COVID, yes.
Now, specifically what I wanted to ask you about is your appearance in that documentary, and you're introduced there with the following blurb for you. To understand things better, it was said, we commissioned an independent expert in water safety. Would you accept that having already been advising the hospital by that point, that wasn't a proper description, you shouldn't have been introduced as an independent expert?
I was independent in that I wasn't involved in any of the building process, the construction process, or the management of the hospital up to that stage. It hadn't occurred to me, the question you're asking me at that time, I have to say.
How did it come about that you got that description in the programme?
I don't think it was my description. I think it was one that the BBC came up with. I don't think I described them. I can't tell you. It's too long ago.
Well, to put that maybe a slightly different way, when they came to you to ask you to participate, did they ask you to participate in a particular capacity, or was it not like that?
No, it wasn't like that. It was just to look at the data and give my opinion.
They didn't say to you, we're looking for an independent expert on Queen Elizabeth. Are you an independent expert on the Queen Elizabeth?
No.
Now, I don't know if you watched your own appearance back, but do you recall what you were doing when you were on screen?
I think I was sitting in a laboratory somewhere. with answering the questions.
And I happened to watch it last night, and you were pictured looking through some documents, and I recognised the logo on one of the documents as being DMA Canyon.
Yes.
Now, you mention in your statement at, it should be page 86, question 74, you're asked about a report published by DMA Canyon in 2015. Now, do you recall that particular report?
Yes, but I hadn't seen it when I went to the hospital.
You have seen it since.
Yes.
And I think perhaps other reports by DMA Canyon as well.
Yes.
And indeed, over the page at question 75, you say that you were impressed by these risk assessments.
I was, and that's quite rare.
Can you explain why?
The risk assessments were quite comprehensive. They were logical. They'd worked from the incoming water supply. They considered the factors that I would have looked for in a risk assessment. As far as Legionella is concerned, I think they did quite a good job. They looked at the management and communication structure, which is often omitted in this type of risk assessments. So overall, it was better than most risk assessments that I see when doing investigations.
In your view, what ought to have happened with them once they were received?
The 2015 one was so identified really dangerous aspects of the water system, the fact that they found E. coli, that there'd been Legionella found earlier, should all have been escalated up to board level to make a decision on whether it was safe to put patients into that hospital.
When you discovered that that hadn't happened, what was your action?
My action?
Your reaction?
Oh, my reaction, sorry. Again, I found it incomprehensible that wouldn't have been escalated. Something like, finding Legionella at commissioning stage, but also E. coli, which is an indication of fecal or sewage contamination of potable water supply, it means that water wasn't safe to drink, to use in a hospital environment.
And once you had the opportunity to read particularly the 2015 report, what conclusion did you reach?
That hospital wasn't safe for the intended patient group. We've got the highest risk patients, bone marrow transplant patients, neutropenic patients who have no ability to fight infection using water that potentially could cause their death.
I don't have any further questions for the witness, my lord.
Dr. Lee, what I propose to do now is break for about 10 minutes just to check with the rest of the room as to whether there's any further questions to be asked. So could I ask you to return to witness room, and I'd hope to be able to have you back here in 10 minutes.
Okay, thank you, my lord.
Well, we'll take 10 minutes to see if there's any more questions. Mr. McKean,
There are no additional questions for the witness, Mark.
thank you. Dr. Lee, I understand there's no more questions, and that means you're free to go. But before you go, can I thank you for your attendance here today, and also the considerable amount of work which will have been involved in preparing your written statement. Both your oral testimony and the written statement are very useful, and I'm grateful for them. But as I've said, you're now free to go. Thank you.
Thank you very much, my lord. Thank you.
My understanding is that we will resume tomorrow with Dr. Peters as the witness and Mr. Connell asking the questions.
Yes, Lord.
Right. Well, can I wish you a good afternoon, and we'll see each other, all being well, tomorrow at 10.